Xu awoke in pitch-black darkness. The woman was completely disoriented. She had no idea where she was located. Her nostrils were practically corroded by a repulsive, nauseating odor. Cautiously feeling the space around her, Xu encountered something alive, squirming beneath her fingers. She instinctively pulled her hand back. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, Xu observed bodies, lifeless bodies, piled on top of one another. The faces of some were frozen in silent screams. Where was she and what had occurred? How could she escape from here? Thoughts flashed one after another in her mind, but the woman couldn't concentrate. Her feet were sinking into a disgusting sludge, accumulated from the decomposition of dead human corpses. One Saturday afternoon in November 1990, a 26-year-old kindergarten teacher named Xu Lixia sat crying on a bench at the train station in Nihei, a town located in northwestern Heilongjiang province, China. The woman had left her husband for good just a couple of hours earlier. Their marriage could never be described as happy from the start. They quarreled over every trivial matter, but that morning, they had argued so fiercely that for Xu, it became the final straw. She rushed to the bedroom, tossed some belongings into a bag, and ran out of the house, wishing never to return. At that moment, she had no specific plan. She didn't know what she would do after leaving home. Only now did she realize she was sitting at the station, simply watching trains come and go. Xu suddenly became aware that there were very few passengers, and the platform was nearly deserted. By Chinese standards, Nihei, where Xu was considered tiny, though it had a population of 70,000. It was situated at the foot of a tall mountain, with farmlands growing wheat, soybeans, and corn on its outskirts. The city center had tall buildings, residential and commercial areas. Generally, even some Chinese people were unaware of Nihei's existence, let alone foreign visitors. However, in the months leading up to this moment, Nihei had unexpectedly made headlines in local news across China due to rather tragic events. The fact was that women had begun disappearing here. Not just one or two, but many more, with the count already reaching dozens. Xu Lixia was aware of at least a dozen women who had vanished without a trace in Nihei over the past few months. When news of the mysterious disappearances hit the front pages, local women became afraid to leave their homes unaccompanied. Who knew what risks might be associated with being alone on the city streets? At this point, the police had no obvious leads regarding the strange vanishings, but many women were last seen at this very station where Xu now sat. In fact, every time Xu walked to work, she tried to stay close to other pedestrians to somehow ensure her safety if anything were to happen. The only thing that reassured her was that most of the missing women were involved in the sex industry. Although Xu was a kindergarten teacher and had no connection to ladies of the night, now, sitting alone on a bench at the empty station, she felt quite vulnerable. Of course, deep down she thought bad things only happened to others, but today she suddenly felt uneasy and realized she had acted quite rashly by running away from home. At one point, Xu decided she should return to the apartment and try to mend things with her husband, if only for her own safety. However, before she could stand up and leave the station, Xu noticed a young man at the other end of the platform. He was dressed in a handsome brown wool coat and stylish trousers, looking as if he had stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine. The stranger, catching Xu's gaze, slowly walked along the platform towards her. Without saying a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a tissue, and offered it to her, having noticed tears in her eyes. The distraught woman was at a loss and didn't know what to do. She looked up at the sky, then quickly glanced around. There was no one else on the platform besides the two of them. It seemed as if everything around had died out, and the space was gripped by an eerie silence. Xu didn't understand how she could have attracted the attention of such an imposing young man, but he kept a respectful distance from her. He didn't try to impose himself, just looked at her sympathetically and held out the tissue. It was a bit strange, suspicious, and even creepy. But as soon as the stranger spoke, all of Xu's anxiety instantly vanished. He asked if she was all right and if she needed any help. The man spoke so sincerely that Xu lowered her guard, took the tissue, and wiped her wet cheeks. Coming closer, the young man asked permission to sit down and inquired about the reason for her tears. It felt as if Xu had been waiting for this question. Without understanding how it happened, she dumped a load of her personal problems on the stranger. Her life over the last few months or even years of this terrible marriage had been a series of troubles. All her emotions, bottled up inside for a long time, simply poured out at this moment. The woman began to cry hysterically. Between sobs, she explained that she had left her husband today and had no idea what to do next. Her entire life had crumbled in an instant, and there seemed to be no light at the end of the tunnel. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Finally, when Xu stopped talking about her troubles, she felt very embarrassed. But her companion didn't show any sign that this bothered him. The whole time, he listened attentively and nodded sympathetically. The man introduced himself. His name was Jiawenge. He said he was a factory director, so he could offer Xu a job to give her a chance to start over. Then he made a suggestion that caused Xu to panic. Jia invited the woman to his home so they could calmly discuss all matters regarding employment. Her suspicious look said it all. The man stood up and was about to leave when Xu unexpectedly stopped him and said she agreed. Perhaps her life at that moment seemed so insignificant to her that she was ready to take a risk and act recklessly. But the guy seemed so sincere and pleasant that she decided to trust him. Xu and Jia stood up, walked silently along the platform, and made their way into the city. They went down the street, walked a couple of blocks, and as soon as they turned the corner, a beautiful house came into view. All her hesitations up to this point vanished at once because she saw a gorgeous red brick building, fully matching the style of her new acquaintance, equally well kept and modern. Jia led his guest to the kitchen, brewed tea himself, and began asking questions about work. He inquired about Xu's skills, considering what duties she could perform at his factory. After Xu finished her tea, Jia suddenly fell silent, as if waiting for the drink to take effect on the woman. His gaze also changed in an instant. Instead of sincere interest, a sinister gleam appeared in his eyes. Xu felt drowsy. Her eyelids grew heavy, her vision sharply deteriorated, and her last thought was that she had been poisoned. Then her mind clouded over, and Xu collapsed, lifeless. A couple of weeks later, a concerned elderly couple approached the police station to report a missing person. However, it wasn't about the kindergarten teacher. Although the woman had vanished 2 weeks ago, no one had reported her missing. Her husband assumed she had left him and gone somewhere. That's how he explained to Xu's employer why she hadn't shown up for work. The officer talking to the elderly couple wasn't at all surprised that someone else hadn't returned home. It was December 1990. Over the past 6 months, 20 young women involved in selling their own bodies had gone missing in Nihei. The police weren't even sure if they had actually been abducted or if they had simply boarded a train and left town to find work. Investigations were conducted, but since there were no leads, no one really searched for them. Only this time, it wasn't about a woman. A businessman had gone missing. However, the details of his disappearance were frighteningly similar to all those escort workers. The guy was last seen at the same railway station where Xu met Jia, so now the investigator began to wonder if this missing man was connected to the vanished ladies of the night and decided it was just a coincidence. By January 1991, 5 more people had gone missing in Nihei, 2 women and 3 men. Now the police had no chance to write it off as these people leaving for work. In total, 26 people, men and women, disappeared in broad daylight without leaving any traces. Finally, in early spring, the Nihei police formed a task force and began investigating all these disappearances. But surprisingly, no bodies or signs that these people were no longer alive were found. No additional information, as if they simply didn't exist in nature. All the police knew was that 26 people had vanished, not counting Xu Lixia, and many of them were last seen at the railway station. It got to the point where this story began to spread across China and turned into a crude joke. Tired of living, go to Nihei. People thought some terrible maniac was roaming the city streets and taking the lives of random passers-by. The investigation into the disappearances hadn't progressed at all by the end of summer 1991. The story spread throughout the country and grew more and more extensive, and the Nihei police still had absolutely no ideas about where these people had gone. The situation started to look much worse when sudden disappearances of people spread beyond the city. Citizens began to vanish in other towns located near Nihei, but everything was somehow connected to the railway line. By autumn of the same year, over 30 people were listed as missing, and the police, as before, had no witnesses or suspects. But everything changed on October 22, 1991. About a year after kindergarten teacher Xu Lixia met Jia Wenge at the city station, and then drank poisoned tea in his house. On that autumn day, the police were conducting a routine check of passengers at a station near the city. This had nothing to do with the ongoing investigation. Patrols were simply stopping suspicious passers-by for public safety purposes and checking their IDs. At some point, one of the officers noticed a young, attractive guy on the platform in a brown wool coat, fashionable trousers, and expensive shoes. The stylish man stood out noticeably from the crowd with his appearance and clothes. When the stranger noticed the policeman's gaze on him, he hastily grabbed a bag, quickly turned around, and started to leave. At the same time, two other people near him did the same thing. They grabbed bags, quickly turned around, and began to move away. All this looked somewhat suspicious, so the police stopped all three and checked the contents of the bags. Inside were packets of prohibited substances. The trio stubbornly ignored the questions asked by the law enforcement officers, so the officers asked them to provide identification. The young man in the brown coat handed over his documents. They listed the same name, Jia Weng, which he had given when meeting Xu a year ago. All three were brought to the police station and began to be interrogated separately. Jia completely refused to comment on the contents of the bags. The second person also refused to cooperate. Then the officers decided to pressure the third and try to break him. It was very noticeable that he was more anxious than his accomplices. So after a short argument, this person began to talk. When the detained individual began to speak, it wasn't about what the investigators were interested in. According to him, the prohibited substances in the bags were trivial compared to what was happening in Jia Wenge's house. The eyes of the present police officers widened. If what this person said was true, the case of mysterious disappearances that had shocked the entire country would soon be solved. The next day, a phone call came into the Nihei police station. On the line was one of the officers who had detained the suspicious trio at the station. He provided local investigators with information that made them instantly drop everything and urgently head to the specified address. A group of 20 police officers and 10 forensic experts headed to Jia Wenge's house. From the outside, everything looked very respectable. A beautiful building standing a bit apart from other houses. A cozy yard with still blooming plants. But as soon as the officers and experts entered, they were hit by an acrid, unpleasant smell. Although the neat furnishings of the house raised no doubts about the owner's cleanliness, the stench, spreading through all the rooms, made it impossible to breathe deeply. As it turned out, the source of the horrible smell was the basement. The officers opened the door leading down, and all they could see was a dark room. But the odor coming from there was so unbearable that they had to hold their noses to avoid suffocating. 2 policemen nearly lost consciousness, and had to go outside to recover. Only after putting on respirators could they go down again. In fact, there was nothing in the basement room that could produce such a terrible smell. It was almost empty. Suddenly, one of those present illuminated a strange hole in the floor with a flashlight right in the middle of the room. And when the police looked into it, they couldn't believe what they saw. At the same time, the group conducting the search upstairs made an equally horrifying discovery. They found a video cassette containing terrible footage that explained what had been happening inside this house. But to understand this, let's go back a year, when Xu Lixia met a handsome man at the station and went to his house to talk about employment. After drinking the tea containing some substance, the woman lost consciousness, but didn't die. Xu woke up several hours later in complete confusion and immediately sensed an acrid, nauseating smell. Since the room was pitch dark, Xu couldn't see anything. She carefully began to feel the space around her with her hands and felt stone everywhere she touched. Eventually, the woman realized she was at the bottom of a shallow well, but there was no water below. Instead, her feet sensed some sticky sludge resembling jelly. Xu tried to touch objects around her, but instinctively pulled her hand back when something moved under her fingers. The woman was utterly bewildered. Where was she? What happened? What smelled so terrible? In panic, she began to scream and call for help. Suddenly, the cover at the top of the well began to move, and some light entered the pit. At first, the woman looked up but saw nothing. Then her gaze shifted down to what surrounded her. At that moment, the hair on her head stirred with horror. Around her lay dead human bodies that had been thrown into this well. Many of them had already begun to rot and decompose, emitting a disgusting stench. The scene that suddenly unfolded before Xu made her nauseous and terrified her to death. The woman vomited several times, then screamed again in horror and pain. Only a strong desire to survive kept her sane. It turned out that the panic-stricken Xu had attracted the attention of the house owner. When Xu looked up again, she saw Jia's face, that attractive man she had met at the station. He stood above, looking at her with a sinister smile. The woman begged him to pull her out of this pit and promised to do anything he asked. The man thought for a moment, then reached down and pulled Xu out of the well to the surface. He decided that he could indeed use an accomplice. A few days later, Xu returned to the station where she first encountered Jia, though this time she was there alone. The woman unhurriedly approached the train platform, not intending to travel anywhere. She surveyed the few passengers waiting for the commuter train and noticed a man who appeared to be a businessman, judging by his professional demeanor. She then walked up to him, sat down nearby, and struck up a conversation. Minutes later, Xu was walking arm in arm with the businessman towards Jia Wenge's house. The woman led her guest to the kitchen and poured some tea. As soon as the man relaxed and lowered his guard, Xu crept up behind him and slipped a garrote around his neck. When the businessman lost consciousness, she and Jia dragged his body to a room on the ground floor. Jia Wenge grabbed a video camera and began filming as Xu climbed on top of the still living but unconscious person, lying on the basement floor, raised a knife, and plunged it into her victim's chest with all her might. It was this footage of Xu taking the life of a stranger, who would later be reported as missing, that was discovered by a police officer on the building's first floor during a search. Jia Wenge turned out to be a serial offender responsible for the disappearance of all these people from train stations and streets in Nihe City and the surrounding areas. He used various methods to persuade them to enter his home, then did terrible things to them, before simply dumping their dead or half-alive bodies into a pit in the middle of the basement room. So, who is Jia Wenge? How did this person become a monster? How did he manage to commit such horrific crimes right under the noses of law enforcement? Jia Wenge was born in Nihe, Heilongjiang Province in 1964. His family was typical of most in the area, not wealthy but hardworking. Both Jia's father and mother worked at a factory, and their monthly wages were sufficient to cover the family's expenses. His parents adored their son and did everything possible to meet his needs and interests. Jia was born intelligent, with a sharp mind. He was one of the top students. During his school years, the young man served on the class committee multiple times. After Jia Wengjie completed junior high school, he took an ordinary job at the factory where his parents once worked. In those days, factory work was considered fairly stable. If Jia had continued to work diligently, a successful career and comfortable future would have awaited him. The boy's mother and father passed away very early, so there was no help to be expected. However, the initial trajectory of his life began to develop quite differently from what his parents had planned. His attractive appearance was to blame. Jia Wengjie was naturally charming with alluring brown eyes, and as he matured, he became even more handsome and confident in his irresistibility, so that in his demeanor, he rivaled some screen stars. Jia dressed stylishly, spoke eloquently, and knew how to appeal to women. Many female factory workers fell under the spell of this young man, and Jia reveled in the feeling of being surrounded by hundreds of flowers, not knowing which to choose, so he pursued romances with several women simultaneously. Some of his lovers were still quite young. In those days, this was considered extremely scandalous. When the factory manager learned of his workers' affairs, he became very angry and issued stern warnings to everyone. However, no prohibitions could keep the girls from their tender feelings for Jia. The young man himself felt like he controlled women's fates and had no intention of giving this up, continuing to date female workers. When rumors of his romantic exploits again reached the manager's ears, he lost patience and fired Jia Wengjie. Lacking any special skills, the guy took a job at a butcher shop to make ends meet. He slaughtered livestock and sold meat. Thanks to Jia's people skills, the business brought in more income each day. However, being spoiled by attention led the young man to frequently quarrel with other employees and argue at every turn. Whenever he was in a bad mood, he would go slaughter animals to calm down. The moment the knife touched fresh meat, he always experienced a strange pleasure. Additionally, Jia was naturally lazy and greedy for pleasures, so after some time, he quit working at the butcher shop. He began associating with local troublemakers, spending whole days in entertainment, throwing around his earnings left and right. Due to his debauchery, Jia visited local brothels every few days. His wife could no longer bear it and was forced to divorce him. However, this did not affect the young man's life at all. He felt not the slightest pang of conscience. At first, Jia simply engaged in small business with his friends to make a living, but gradually modest earnings ceased to satisfy him. Driven by greed, the guy began stealing chickens, ducks, sheep, and cattle. After each theft, he immediately returned to his former life so the police wouldn't track him down. It was this impunity that made Jia believe he would never be caught, and he felt invincible. The criminal group's ambitions grew, and they gradually moved from petty theft to robberies. When attacking people, Jia was always at the forefront, holding his butcher's knife at the ready. His entire demeanor in those moments expressed ferocity. After several successful robberies, the young man turned his attention to foreign traders. To conceal his true nature from people and avoid trouble, he began carrying out villainous acts alone. The remote location and poor transportation provided Jia with the necessary conveniences. To reach Nihei City, one had to get off the train, transfer to a bus to the provincial capital, then walk to the destination. At that time, people engaged in trade often carried cash. Whenever a new businessman arrived at the station, Jia pretended to be enthusiastic about helping him reach Nihei, while actually leading the trader to a secluded and remote place, robbing him, then taking extreme measures to silence the businessman forever. In the 1970s and 1980s, Nihei City in Heilongjiang Province essentially became a forbidden zone. After several cases of businessmen disappearing, many were reluctant to go there unless necessary. Fewer and fewer people came to Nihei to do business. Jia's criminal activities ceased to bring in income. He wandered aimlessly through the streets looking for suitable targets until one day he encountered a group of well-dressed women seeking clients for evening encounters. A spark of hope ignited in Jia's heart. Unlawful thoughts arose, and he began to act. Thanks to his attractive appearance and eloquence, the young man easily persuaded several women to go to his home. After intimate activities, Jia unexpectedly transformed from a gallant man into a butcher and asked the women to hand over all their valuables if they didn't want to say goodbye to life. The women obediently complied with the demands, after which they ended up in the basement one by one. After Jia's first successful operation, his desires began to spiral out of control. He started frequently indulging in this relaxed and gratifying method of retribution. From July to November 1990, in just 4 months, Jia single-handedly ended the lives of several individuals. Over time, the underground storage could no longer accommodate the number of victims. The homeowner had to dig a special well to dispose of the bodies. In just a few months, he was responsible for more than a dozen missing women. Then Jia Wenge's life trajectory changed again due to the appearance of a woman. Her name was Xu Lixia. He met her at the station where she was distraught after an argument with her husband. In reality, Xu was destined for the same fate as the other women. However, she survived and became the monster's accomplice. At the moment her life was at stake, Xu made an agreement with Jia Wenge that she would do anything he asked. From that point on, the victim profile shifted from women selling themselves for money to random men. And the very first victim at Xu's hands was the businessman that the elderly couple was looking for. It was footage of this act that was captured on the tape found by police in Jia's house. This woman deceptively lured men into the house, where they were subsequently killed and robbed of all cash and valuable items. When summer arrived, the attacks in Nihei noticeably decreased. Due to hot weather, an unpleasant odor of decaying bodies began to spread from the cellar, which neighbors might eventually discover. At the same time, more and more plainclothes individuals appeared on city streets, observing the railway station and surrounding area. In this environment, Jia had to restrain himself for a while, but financial resources were depleting surprisingly quickly. A bold idea came to him. If it became dangerous to attack people in Nihei, they could go elsewhere. So he took Xu Lixia and continued the series of crimes outside the city. During this time, they visited various places, taking several lives. But someday, it had to end. And on October 22nd, 1991, the strange behavior of the accomplices caught the attention of local police. The officers thought they had caught ordinary illegal substance dealers, not realizing they had in their hands a crazed maniac who had been terrorizing an entire city. In reality, Xu Lixia wasn't the only person involved in Jia's criminal scheme. He managed to convince 2 others, including his ex-wife, to assist him in carrying out his acts. According to Hangzhou Railway Station police, the main culprits were 2 men and 1 woman, Jia Wenge, Li Xuhua, and Xu Lixia, all from Heilongjiang province. In this well-planned operation, Xu was responsible for seducing men, while the other 2 controlled the victim. Later, the public wondered what kept people around Jia. All of Jia's accomplices had ample opportunities to escape and report everything to the police, but for some reason, they didn't. Even considering they were under complete control, there were still many doubts about their choices. Xu, after working with her captor for some time, finally realized she was committing a sin by taking innocent lives. In fact, she tried to escape Jia's clutches several times, but each time he managed to hold her back. He simply threatened the lives of her loved ones. To make the woman fully submit to him, Jia reminded her of her 3-year-old son, saying that if she dared to call the police, her child would be sent to the afterlife that same day. So Xu gradually abandoned the idea of escape and decided to continue cooperating with this monster. However, it was Xu Lixia who broke down during interrogation and revealed the basement in Jia's house. It turned out that the officers showed her sympathy. Seeing the woman shaking, they brought her a quilt and covered her, then fulfilled her request by buying personal hygiene items that Xu needed. The woman confessed that ultimately it was the kindness of the police that broke her. Touched by their care, tears flowed from Xu's eyes. When detectives asked if she wanted to explain anything, the woman raised her head and began to tell a story that even experienced investigators who had seen much in their lifetime weren't prepared for. The unexpected compassion seemed to melt Xu Lixia's cold heart, and she became the key to solving this case. It was noticeable that after confessing, the woman felt relief, as if she had shed a burden of many years. When Xu was 5, both her parents died, and she grew up with her older sister. The family was very poor, and the girls often went hungry. Later, Xu became a kindergarten teacher, got married, and had a child. But married life wasn't satisfying. The couple often argued, and sometimes her husband even raised his hand against her. This became the starting point. Then Xu told about all the crimes committed by her and Jia Wengje, revealing where to find the bodies of all missing people. After hearing Xu's explanation, law enforcement didn't immediately believe her, thinking the woman was making up fantastic stories to deliberately confuse the investigation. Nevertheless, the next day, they called the Nihei Police Department and reported the alleged mass grave of missing victims. In the basement of Jia Wenge's house, inside a makeshift well, 42 bodies were found, 24 women and 18 men. Before the police were piled dozens of corpses, most of which had already decomposed, emitting a revolting odor. This was accompanied by the buzzing of numerous flies. No one knew about the homeowner's criminal activities until the day he and 2 accomplices were detained at the station during a routine security check. When this shocking, bloody case was uncovered, the 28-year-old criminal calmly admitted to ending the lives of 42 people. When asked to specify how many victims there actually were, the man dismissively replied that he didn't remember the exact number. According to Jia's own statement, for him, taking a human life was easier than pinching an ant. This not only didn't cause him trouble or guilt, but on the contrary, made him happy. All the criminals, including Jia Weng, Li Xiuhua, and Xu Lixia, were paraded through the city streets. Local residents, learning who was behind all these disappearances, became furious and began throwing stones and anything they could get their hands on at the arrestees. Jia Wenge received a death sentence. He showed no remorse for his actions and even smiled when the judge read the verdict. During the execution on January 24, 1992, to atone for the guilt before the victims, 42 bullets were used for each life taken. Xu Lixia, despite admitting her mistake and telling investigators about the burial in Jia's house, couldn't atone for her crime. In the end, she was also sentenced to death. Before her execution, Xu wrote a letter to her sister, saying she had committed many sins and must die. Nevertheless, she was glad to have put an end to this nightmare in the abyss. It didn't free her soul from torment, but brought some relief. Due to the horrific nature of his crimes, Jia Wengji became known as the South China Ripper. Although he and all his accomplices were executed, this didn't bring peace to the victims' families. As in the 90s when these crimes occurred, today, the city of Nihei still has a bad reputation. Many still call it the city of bandits. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.